Some mornings carry a weight that has no name. Not the weight of grief exactly, not of regret. Something older, quieter, the kind that settles in the chest when a man has lived long enough to know that certain things, once lost, do not return. It was a Tuesday in Ashford Bay when everything changed. Not dramatically, not with thunder or fire or the sound of something breaking. It changed the way the tide changes, slowly, inevitably, and with a grace so quiet you almost miss it. Preacher felt it the moment he walked in. The diner smelled like strong tea and fried onions, with something faintly sweet drifting from the bakery case, a smell that felt like memory, like a kitchen from 30 years ago, like a life before the road became everything. He took his usual booth in the corner, the one with the dark blue vinyl split like old paint, the one where the window blurred the world outside into soft watercolors of gray and pale gold. He sat down, his men settled beside him, broad shoulders, quiet eyes, leather and denim worn like armor. They did not speak, they did not need to. In 11 years of riding together, silence had become their most honest language. Outside, the sky hung low and pale. Tired strangers drifted past without looking in, and Preacher watched them all, the way he always watched, not with suspicion, but with the quiet attention of a man who understood that every passing face carried a story heavier than it looked. He was halfway through his coffee when the door opened, and something in the air shifted. His real name was Daniel Harrow, but no one had called him that in a long time. On the road, names shed like old skin, and what replaced them was truer. He had earned the name Preacher, not because he spoke of God, but because he spoke of honor, quietly, consistently, in the way he treated every stranger and every enemy alike, with fairness, with weight. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that had known both violence and tenderness. There were lines on his face that had no business being there at 44, but roads will do that to a man, especially roads taken alone, in the dark, carrying things no one else was willing to carry. He led a brotherhood called the Iron Cross Riders, 12 men who had each, in their own way, been broken by the world and rebuilt by loyalty. They were not saints, they did not pretend to be, but there was a code among them, unwritten but absolute. You do not walk past someone who was falling, not ever. Preacher had learned that code the hard way. He had learned it from a man who was no longer alive to teach it, his father. Thomas Harrow had been a veteran of 2 wars and one long, unforgiving peace. He had come home from the battlefield not with medals on his chest, but with silence in his eyes, the kind of silence that wraps around a man like fog and never fully lifts. He had raised Daniel alone, in a small house near the coast, where the wind always smelled of salt and the winters came early. He was not an easy man to love. He was distant, difficult, sometimes unreachable, but he was present, and in a world full of fathers who disappeared, presence was everything. Every Sunday morning, without fail, Thomas Harrow would put on his best shirt, comb his silver hair with care, and take his son to the small diner at the edge of town. They would sit in the corner booth, they would order strong tea and eggs, and Thomas would talk, not about the wars, not about the things that had hollowed him out, but about honor, about what it meant to be a man worth remembering. Daniel, he would say, wrapping his big scarred hands around his cup, the world will try to make you hard. Let it make you strong instead. There's a difference. Hard men break things. Strong men hold them together. Preacher had carried those words for 20 years. And then, 3 years ago, Thomas Harrow had disappeared. Not in death, or at least not the kind Preacher could confirm. He had simply drifted. The early stages of dementia had taken pieces of him quietly, like a thief in the night. He had wandered from his care home one winter evening and never been found. The police searched. Preachers searched. For 6 months he rode every road within 100 miles of Ashford Bay, stopping at every diner, every shelter, every small town that might have taken in a lost old man. Nothing. He had come back to Ashford Bay with nothing but the echo of his father's voice and a grief he didn't know how to name. The elderly man stepped inside, and time seemed to slow. His coat was neatly brushed, but thin at the cuffs. His silver hair was combed with extraordinary care, the kind of care that speaks of dignity held on too tightly, of a man who has lost much but refuses to lose himself entirely. His shoes were clean. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed the door open against the coastal wind. He stood in the doorway for a moment, blinking against the warmth of the diner, as if surprised that warmth still existed in the world. Loneliness clung to him, not loudly, but deeply, like a shadow that had grown comfortable at his side. It was in the way his eyes moved around the room without finding a face they recognized. It was in the careful, deliberate way he chose a table, not the nearest one, but the one closest to the window, as if he needed to keep the outside world in sight, as if he was afraid of being completely enclosed. He sat down slowly, took off his coat with the patience of a man for whom every movement now required intention, folded it neatly over the seat beside him. And then he sat with his hands flat on the table and stared at the menu without reading it. The waitress came. He ordered tea, just tea, and when she walked away, his eyes drifted to the window, and something in his expression, something behind the dignity, behind the careful composure, cracked open just slightly, just enough for the light to catch it. It was grief, old grief, the kind that has long stopped being sharp and has instead become simply weight, a permanent resident, an uninvited guest who stopped being a guest years ago and is now simply part of the furniture. Preacher watched him from across the room, and something turned over in his chest. He couldn't explain it. There was nothing remarkable about the old man, not in the way the world measures remarkable. He was not famous, not powerful, not visibly extraordinary. He was simply an old man, alone, in a diner by the sea, drinking tea he had ordered because he needed somewhere to be. But Preacher had spent his life learning to read people the way sailors read weather, not by what was visible, but by what was coming. And what he read in this man was something that reached across the room and grabbed him by the throat. Courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that stands on stages or charges into battle. The quiet, aching bravery of someone who has lost much, perhaps everything, and still got up this morning, still combed his hair, still put on his best coat, still walked out into the world alone, even though the world had long since stopped making a place for him in it. Preacher knew that courage. He had seen it once before, in a small house near the coast, in a man with scarred hands and silence in his eyes, in a father who had never fully come home from the war but showed up every single Sunday morning and ordered strong tea and talked about honor. He stood up before he had made any conscious decision to stand. His men looked at him. He shook his head slightly, "Stay," and crossed the room alone. "Mind if I sit?" The old man looked up. His eyes were blue, pale blue, like winter sky, and for a moment they were sharp with the instinctive wariness of someone who has learned that kindness from strangers often has a price. Then something softened. "No," he said quietly. "I don't mind." Preacher sat, caught the waitress's eye and ordered 2 teas. Then he looked at the old man properly, the way his father had taught him, not at the surface, but through it. "My name's Daniel," he said. He hadn't used that name in years. It felt strange in his mouth, like a word in a language half forgotten. "You from Ashford Bay?" The old man shook his head. "No, I was passing through." He paused, looked out the window. "I'm not entirely sure where I'm going, if I'm honest." Something about the way he said it, not embarrassed, just truthful, made Preacher's chest tighten. "What's your name?" he asked. The old man was quiet for a moment. The question seemed to cost him something, as if names too had become uncertain territory. Then, "Robert," he said. "Robert Kane." Preacher nodded. They sat with their tea. Outside, the sea wind pressed against the glass. "Do you have family?" Preacher asked, gently, the way you ask when you already suspect the answer. Robert Kane looked at his hands. "A son," he said, "somewhere." His voice was steady, but his jaw tightened. "We lost each other, long time ago now." He looked up. "I used to look for me, I think. I would wake up sometimes, certain he was close. Isn't that foolish?" Preacher said nothing. His throat had closed. "I had a good mind once," Robert continued, with a dignified matter-of-factness that was somehow more heartbreaking than tears would have been. "Things got confused for a while. I lost time, lost places, lost myself a little." He almost smiled. "But I remembered him, always remembered him. Even when I forgot my own name, I remembered my boy." Preacher set down his cup. His hands were shaking, because Robert Kane had a scar on his left hand, a specific scar, curved like a crescent moon from a fishing accident on a Tuesday afternoon in 1987. And Preacher knew that scar. He had held that hand crossing roads. He had watched that hand wrap around a Sunday morning cup of tea. He had watched that hand point at him across a diner table and say, "Hard men break things, strong men hold them together." "Robert," he said. His voice barely made it out. "What was your son's name?" The old man looked at him, and something moved in those pale blue eyes, something slow and enormous like a ship turning in deep water. "Daniel," he whispered. The world did not stop. The diner kept its noise, clinking cups, low voices, the hiss of something frying. The sea wind kept pressing at the glass. The overhead light kept falling in its ordinary way across ordinary tables. But in the corner booth, in the space between one breath and the next, everything that had been broken for 3 years began, slowly and painfully and beautifully, to reassemble. "Dad." It was barely a word. It was barely a sound. It was the kind of utterance that comes from somewhere below language, from the place where a son keeps his father long after the world has declared the keeping impossible. Robert Kane looked at the man across from him. Really looked. Past the lines the road had put on his face, past the leather and the years and the grief, into the eyes he had looked into every Sunday morning for the first 18 years of this man's life. His lip trembled. His carefully maintained composure, that extraordinary, heartbreaking dignity, wavered for the first time. "Daniel?" he breathed. And then Preacher, this man who had not cried in 11 years, this man who had held his grief like a stone in his chest and carried it silently across 100,000 miles of road, leaned across the table and took his father's trembling hands in his own. "I looked for you," he said, his voice broke on it. "Dad, I never stopped looking." Robert's eyes filled. "I know," he whispered. "I know, son. I felt it." When Robert Kane reached across and gripped his son's hands back, tight, certain, with a strength that had no business living in those thin, trembling fingers, every person in that small seaside diner felt something they couldn't name. Conversations dropped. Strangers looked up. The waitress, halfway across the room with a pot of coffee, stopped walking and stood very still. Because some moments do not belong only to the people inside them. Some moments radiate. Some reunions are so fundamentally true that the whole room becomes briefly, quietly holy. They stayed in the diner for 3 hours. Preacher's men moved quietly to a different table without being asked, ordering food and speaking in low voices, giving the corner booth the privacy it deserved. One of them, a big man named Cruz, who had not been known to show emotion in 7 years of riding, had to look out the window for a very long time at nothing in particular. Father and son talked, slowly at first, carefully, filling in the 3 years of silence with truth. Robert's memory was not what it was. Some things were hazy, others sharp as glass. But he was lucid today, present today, in the way that sometimes mercifully happened, as if some part of him had held on to this remaining clarity for exactly this moment. I wasn't sure who I was for a while, but I always knew I was someone's father. That never left. Preacher squeezed his hand and couldn't speak. He called ahead to arrange proper care, a specialist in Ashford Bay, a good facility, the best he could find. He would not leave. The road had been his home for 11 years, but some things matter more than the road. Some things call you back to yourself. Before they left the diner, Robert looked around the small, ordinary room, the salt-blurred windows, the worn vinyl booths, the smell of tea and memory, and said, "I came in here because I was cold, and I needed somewhere to be." Robert looked at his father, at the silver hair combed with such extraordinary care, at the thin coat and the steady eyes and the courage that had walked through that door alone on a Tuesday morning in Ashford Bay. "You're not alone anymore," he said. They walked out together into the pale coastal light,